Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here, and we're going to go over World War One. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened during this time frame. At least we're going to go over it in throughout this chapter, but this is section one, and we're talking about World War One beginning. Um, what's interesting about World War One in this time frame is that we're seeing that basically the United States did want to go to war. Um, we we were seeing what was going on in Europe, and we were really trying to do our best to stay out of Europe. But what was happening kind of dragged us in, and we do know that a lot of those pressures from Europe kind of led us into this war. But part of it was also on our doing as well as Europe's. But it was three main factors: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, that led to this. So let's start with nationalism. Nationalism, we're starting to see that during this time, politics are really building up in in Europe. We're seeing that with the Industrial Revolution, it really drove a lot of new jobs with new factories, and we start to see that as new jobs and politics are being played out in the Western world. We're seeing immigrants are moving from place to place to try and get a job in the Industrial Revolution. Well, excuse me, with the immigrant population kind of moving around, we see that countries are adopting what is called nationalism, a devotion to interests and culture of one's nation. Basically saying, like, if you want to be in this country, you've got to support everything about this country. That means the flag, that means the government, that means the people, everything about their culture. And that's why it's so important to when we watch World Cup soccer, for example. When you see the national anthems played, then why those crowds get so amped up with the anthem. It's not so much that they're a big fan of the anthem; it's the nationalism. It's showing pride, and you see when they're showing pictures of people singing it, they're like really prideful, really a lot of pride in singing the song. Especially God Save the Queen. I just love God Save the Queen from Great Britain. It's amazing, and you can just see like almost people crying with Save the Queen. Um, and look, nothing with the Star Spangled Banner. It's great poem, and turns into a national song. But it's really cool to watch some of these different national anthems during the World Cup because people just get so into it. But um, excuse me, nationalism really kind of brought out competitivism, antagonistic rivalries between nations, and really kind of pinpoint, like, look, if you're going to stay in this country, you got to be supportive. Many feared of Germany and its power during this time, and also we start to see a lot of ethnic groups are changing and moving around, and so independent nations are being formed, and it's really influencing these nations. So Russia, is one of those countries as well in Europe that regarded a lot of different peoples and ethnic groups. One of them was the Slavic people, from Serbs. The Slavic peoples were the Serbs from Serbia, located in the Balkans. And but a lot of millions of ethnic Serbs lived under actually the Austrian-Hungary rule. So as a result, Russia and Austria-Hungary were rivals over the country of Serbia. And so imperialism also during this time was also a main reason or cause, because we remember we talked a little bit about in chapter 10, the United States was going through this acquiring nations because it was building an empire, and part of building an empire is kind of being able to capture some resources. And in order to do that, some political control and economic control, you had to gather colonies that had materials needed, and to create new markets for manufactured goods. And we start to see Germany's industrializing at this time and competing with France and Britain during the Industrial Revolution. And also, the other thing they had was militarism. And so, also during this time, is you're seeing as they're building up empires, you had to build a military because you're kind of worried about somebody coming in into your territory, taking it, and really potentially your enemies really having an influence in your area. And so a lot of these individuals were trying to prevent the enemy from capturing their land. So militarism was big, development of armed forces and their use as a tool of diplomacy. We see by 1890, Germany has strongest army on European continent, competes with Britain for sea power, and leads other powers to join naval arms race. And we start to see that France and Italy and the United States are all kind of trying to really put together a military or army to show off their power. And that's just, and basically the idea was, hey, don't mess with me because I just got these missiles behind me. So that's kind of the way of thinking of militarism. Like, don't mess with us. Don't try to take our territories away because we got this army waiting for you. But the problem is that it's like poker. You know, you start to see that. Oh, I see. You put out that $100 chip. I call you, and then I add 50 or another 100. And so we start to see that these other countries are going, okay, I'll one up you better. And so we start to see alliances are needed. In 1907, we see two major defense alliances. The Triple Entente, which is later known as the Allies, consisted of France, Britain, and Russia. Then there was the Triple Alliance, consisted of Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy. Then Germany, Austria-Hungary came together with Ottoman Empire, mostly in the Middle Eastern lands controlled by the Turks, and later they became known as the Central Powers. So this was a way of national security, international security, to basically protect power and to kind of bring a balance. So it's like, I've got friends, and I had, two other friends. I have, it's me and two other friends against this person, and so you could see that the balance is off. So this person realizes, well, I need to get it balanced, and so I've got to get some other friends and to be on an even playing field. So we start to see that people are teaming up as a way to protect what they got and to get some help just in case. And so we start to see this is tipping point building up. There's like a bucket, like a bucket sometimes will tip over because there's too much water. It's like, at the a splash pad, they have those little flimsy buckets, and you add water, and hey, it holds it still for eventually, but then when you add too much, it leans it over one side and it comes crashing and spilling over. Well, that's what happens is that bucket is, first you get the nationalism, imperialism, and then you militarism, and then you put in alliances, and that just causes this big massive spillover. And basically what we start to see is a powder keg building up in the Balkan Peninsula during this time, and sparks are flying, but luckily the powder keg hasn't exploded. But Russia, who is wanting access into the Mediterranean, is being blocked by the Ottoman Empire thanks to Germany. And so Austria-Hungary had taken control of Bosnia in 1878, accused Serbia of subverting its rule over Bosnia, and the powder keg was ready to explode. And so we see in June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his heir, Austrian throne, visited Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. And your answer number 5, by the way, is assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We see that as they're driving, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip stepped from the crowd, basically acting like he was getting something to eat, and basically stepped up, and he got close to the vehicle and shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia, killing them. Princip was a part of what is called the Black Hand, an organization promoting Serbian nationalism. The assassinations touched off a diplomatic crisis. In July 28th, Austria and Hungary declared that was expected to be a short war against Serbia. The alliance system pulled one of the nations after another into conflict, and by August Germany obligated by treaty to support Austria-Hungary and declared war on Russia. Then that caused a domino effect because once Russia was declared war on Germany on August 3rd. We see France gets into it. Then Germany invaded Belgium, in which that was Britain's alliance, and they get into the war. So next thing you know, domino effect, we've got World War I. So the fighting starts on August 3rd of 1914, and Germany invades Belgium, like I said, following a strategy known as the Schefflin Plan. This plan was holding action against the Russians, combined with quick drive through the Belgium to Paris. Then eventually we see France had fallen, to two German armies and would eventually defeat Russia. So they're sweeping across Belgium. Civilians are fleeing. We're seeing unable to save Belgium. The Allies move to Marne River in France, where they halted the German advance in September 1914, which creates what is known as trench warfare. So we see both sides are kind of going back and forth, and they're digging their heels in, really kind of digging in and really making sure that neither side can kind of get either in either one's area. So by 1915, we see that they would everybody would kind of dig their own little trenches, these rat-infested trenches crossing from France, from Belgian coast to Swiss south. So, Germany, though, they thought about it. They were like, this may take a long time. So we're going to build some really comfortable trenches. So they built some that had like nice little quarters for the officers, and some that actually had electricity. So you're like, hey, they did a good job there. But the Allies, not so much. They actually didn't plan it very well, and some of theirs were muddy and wet and gross, and wasn't the best conditions. But you had the front line, you had support and reserve. Front line was probably the most dangerous. You had a lot of heavy fire coming at the soldiers. Soldiers spent a period of time in each kind of trench. Dugouts or underground rooms where the officers' quarters and command posts were. Not the most comfortable, very hard to sleep. It was not the best. War is not fun. But between the trench complexes lay no man's land, a barren of expense, of mud, pockmarked with shell carters and filled with barbed wires. Basically, so you have a trench here and a trench here, trenches there. So two sides, and then you had this middle ground. And in the middle ground, they would have mines, they would have barbed wire, and it was basically if you try to get up there and go after the enemy, you're going to get mowed down with a machine gun. And so during the First Battle of Somme, we see which the battle began July 1st, 1916. It lasted until mid-November. The British suffered 60,000 casualties the first day alone. Final casualties totaled about 1.2 million, yet only about 7 miles of ground changed hands. So this bloody trench warfare in which armies fought were mere yards of ground in over 3 years. So very little, by inches, did they gain any ground. Eventually, we see that the Americans are like, we have no reason to get in this war. We're 3,000 miles away. There's really no reason for us to be there. We don't want to risk American lives. We don't want to be a part of this. So very divided in America, though. Some people were like, yeah, we should go support Europe. Others were like, no. A lot of socialist pacifists, many ordinary people against this war didn't want this. Pacifist was like, hey, I'm not for war. War is not me. We do see, though, some imperialists struggled between Germany and England to control markets. So this becomes an issue because we're like, hey, we do business with these countries. We want to support them, but it was hard to figure out who. And then our colonies in China, Africa, and Middle East became an issue. So it was like, oh, what do we do to protect them in that market? A lot of naturalized citizens concerned about the effort on the country of birth. We see German Americans sympathize with the Germans, and Irish remember British oppression. So a lot of them are like, yeah, Britain can go, where. They didn't like them. But many Americans were very close to Britain, and so we're starting to see a commonality because of language and because of our legal systems, our history together. So America kind of was like, yeah, we kind of side more with the Allies economically. And so this kind of changes our ties with the Central Powers. And it really does, Central Powers takes us in and goes, we're going to remember that. So before the war, American trade with Britain and France was more than doubled in its trade than with Germany. And so we kind of pick sides with the Allies. The Allies are going, hey, United States, we could use some supplies in 1915. So even though the majority of Americans favored the Allies rather than the Central Powers, they still didn't want to join the fight. It's like, okay, we picked a side, but we're only going to help the Allies. We're not going to, as far as like giving them supplies, we're not going to fight though. But we see by 1917 things are going to change. We're going to be eventually mobilized for war, primarily due to ensure Allied repayment of debts to the United States, and then eventually prevent the Germans from threatening United States shipping. We do see that the British decided, hey, we're going to do a blockade on Germany during this time. The idea was to kind of slow down any opportunity to get food or fertilizer, things that they needed for like weapons, as well as opportunities to really just help their situation in war. So First, any American ships carrying goods for Germany refused to challenge the blockade. So America was like, we're done with that. We're not going to help you out there, Germany. And secondly, Germany found it increasingly difficult to import foodstuffs and fertilizers for crops as well. So by 1917, we see famine was awry. An estimated 750,000 Germans starved to death as a result of the British blockade. Americans had been angry at the British blockade because a lot of Americans are like, hey, don't put us in a situation where you're going to make the Germans mad, because they were like, hey, it also prevented American goods from reaching German ports. But we see that this or Germans' response to all this stuff is ultimately going to switch sides, and we see what happens is Germany's response. So even though there were some Americans who were like, yeah, we don't 100% support the Germans, but we're not against the Germans. It's going to change because the Germans respond with U-boats, with these underwater ships. I mean, they're in some ways they were submarines, but they weren't quite as sophisticated as today's submarines, where they could go a lot deeper. I mean, but they were underwater, and they would basically shoot down ships, and so they would counter with that on the blockade. And it was fine for a while, though. Wilson and the government was like, hey, we can't tell you what to do, but just make sure you don't sink our boats. What happens is May 7th, 1915, a U-boat sank a British liner. And again, this is your definition to Lusitania. You're going, it's not an American liner. Okay, you're right. It's not American. But it was off the southern coast of Ireland, and it killed or lost over 1,100 people. 128 of them were Americans. And so that eventually upset America when that got back. Oh my goodness, 128 Americans died. And I understand, it's one thing. It's like, I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's just one life or 100, but it's 128 is different from one. And so we see that, and even if it was one American, I'm pretty sure America at that time would have been like, oh, how dare they? And so there was a big cry of like foul for Germans. So it didn't quite get them to go, we're ready to go to war. It was more of like, shame on you, Germany. How dare you? We're mad at you. And Germans defended their actions. They thought, oh, the liner was carrying ammunition. That's why we. But Wilson protested back, and ultimately we see that Germany just is still sinking other ships, like the Sussex, which sank, and it was an American boat this time. Had 80 Americans, and this one caused even more outrage with America. It's like the first time, it's like, fine, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. First one, shame on them, but then the second time, shame on me, because we should have, striked a little bit harder on them. So anyway, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So it's kind of like that aspect of thinking. But Germany asked the United States to get Britain to the end, to end the food blockade. Otherwise, they would continue with submarine warfare. We see, though, we have an election year around this time in 1916. Wilson is the Democratic candidate, and he's going up against Republican-nominated Supreme Court Justice Charles Evan Hughes. Wilson campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Hughes was pledging to uphold America's right to freedom of the seas, but also promised not to be severe on Germany. So basically, Wilson was basically landing on, I didn't send us to Europe. And that was his whole plan. And Hughes was like, look, I can do that too, but I'm going to be less severe on Germany. I'm going to make sure we don't go to war. Whereas Wilson, he's been a little too tough on Germany. Even though he says, yeah, we didn't go to war, we're this close to going to war under his leadership. And Hughes had gone to bed thinking, hey, I got this one. I've pinpointed on some flaws on Wilson's first term as a president. And also, I can prove that I can lead the American people during this time. And a reporter actually tried to reach him and let him know of Wilson's victory, but an aide said, the president can't be disturbed. Well, then the reporter then quoted back, well, you better, this is the reporter, well, when he wakes up, tell him he's no longer the president, because eventually he lost. Because you have to understand, especially back then, telegraphs and telegrams, messages can be late, um, and sometimes predictions or projections are not as accurate at that point in time with the information. And eventually, sometimes it took a little bit longer to clarify or confirm, but eventually they got it pretty quick. It was getting faster, and it was fast enough that night. After the election, Wilson tried to, create mediate between the warring alliances, but ultimately that attempt failed. We see in a speech at the Senate in 1917, President called for peace without victory, a peace between equals, in which neither side would impose harsh terms on the other. But what we're going to find out is that, Wilson had these big, massive plans for a big, league of nations, like the Justice League, kind of, where everybody comes together and we're like friends and we're gonna do what's right. But he wanted a league for peace, but and extend democracy and maintain freedom. But we're gonna see that's a lot harder than he thinks. Your definition for Zimmerman note is everything in blue here, by the way. Ultimately, what happens is Germans ignore Wilson's call for peace, and a lot of leaders actually hope that to defeat Britain with unrestricted submarine warfare. On January 31st, the Kaiser announced, which is kind of like the main leader, announced that the U-boats would sink all ships in British waters, hostile or neutral, on sight. So basically saying, America, that goes for you. Just be warned that you may get sunk. Wilson, stunned by this, German decision meant that the United States would have to go to war, but the president felt like, hey, I'm going to hold back. I made a campaign promise. I take him out of war. I'm not going to go to war. However, the Zimmern note, a telegram from a German foreign minister to German ambassador in Mexico, was intercepted by the British agents. The Zimmern note proposed alliance of Germany, Mexico against the United States. Because you remember, during this time, around 1916, 1917, Wilson is not happy with Mexico, especially with Pancho Villa. And we talked about in the previous chapter, it was really close to going to war with Mexico, but we're lucky. But Germany starts to stir up the pot a little bit and go, maybe we get these guys in a war, then the United States is out of this war over here. Well, eventually, 4 unarmed American merchant ships sunk after the note was ultimately leaked and published. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that leads to the United States ultimately going to war. Russian monarchy replaced representative government. War of democracies against monarchies as well. Wilson, at this point, Wilson calls for war to make world safe for democracy. And on April 2nd of 1917, he basically says, as senators and representatives, ambassadors, members of the Supreme Court, and other guests crowded into the building, he basically delivered a war resolution. Congress passed the resolution a few days later, and Wilson and many Americans truly believed the United States had to join the war to pave the way for a future order of peace and freedom. A resolved by anxious nation held its breath as the United States prepared for. We didn't want to join the war, but Germany kind of forced her hand, and with their submarine warfare. All right, that does it for section 1. We'll do section 2 tomorrow.